Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. I've always been fascinated by the unknown. Stories of strange encounters and unexplained phenomena have captivated me since I was a kid. But I never thought I'd become part of one. This happened about 3 years ago during a late summer camping trip. I'd taken a few days off work and decided to head out to the mountains for some solitude. I chose a spot far from the usual campgrounds, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and the wilderness. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking, fishing, and enjoying the peace and quiet. It was on the third night that things took a turn for the strange. I was sitting by the campfire, the flames crackling softly, when I noticed something unusual. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire area had been muted. An uneasy feeling crept over me, but I brushed it off as just being paranoid. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I was jolted awake by a blinding light. At first I thought it was a full moon or maybe a helicopter, but the light was too intense, too focused. My heart pounded in my chest as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The light was coming from the woods, an eerie, pulsating glow. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but I couldn't resist. I had to know what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way towards the light. As I got closer, I began to hear a faint humming noise, almost like electricity. The air around me felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Then I saw it. In a small clearing, hovering about 10 feet above the ground, was a circular object. It was about 20 feet in diameter with a smooth, metallic surface that reflected the light of my flashlight. The object didn't make a sound other than the low hum. I stood there, frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. Suddenly, the light intensified, and I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was as if my entire body was being scanned, examined. Panic set in, and I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, held in place by an unseen force. A few moments later, the light dimmed, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The object slowly ascended, disappearing into the night sky without a trace. I stumbled back to my campsite, my mind racing. What had I just experienced? Was it real, or had I imagined the whole thing? I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the lingering fear told me otherwise. The next morning, I packed up and left, cutting my trip short. As I drove back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow, every passing car made me jump. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I'd wake up with unexplained bruises and cuts, and I began to experience vivid, disturbing dreams. In these dreams, I was back in the clearing, surrounded by blinding light, unable to move. One night I woke up to find a strange mark on my arm. It was a small, circular burn, almost like a brand. Panic set in and I went to the doctor, but they couldn't explain it. The mark didn't look like anything they'd seen before. As time went on, the dreams became more frequent and intense. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to move on their own. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the whole story. Who would believe me? One evening, as I was sitting in my living room, I heard a faint tapping at my window. My heart raced as I slowly approached. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with large black eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I stumbled back, fumbling for my phone, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. My hands shook as I called the police, but they found no evidence of anyone being outside. That night I hardly slept. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I decided to set up a camera in my bedroom, hoping to catch whatever was haunting me. The next morning I reviewed the footage with a growing sense of dread, At around 3 a.m., the camera picked up a strange distortion, like static. For a few seconds, the screen went completely white, and when it cleared, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was the same figure I'd seen outside. It was only visible for a moment before disappearing into thin air. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I felt trapped, helpless. Desperation led me to research similar encounters. I found stories of people who had experienced close encounters with extraterrestrial beings, but their tales were often dismissed as delusions or hoaxes. Yet the details matched my experiences too closely to be mere coincidence. I reached out to a support group for people who claimed to have had similar encounters. I attended a few meetings, hoping to find some semblance of understanding or relief. The stories I heard were eerily similar to mine, and for the first time I felt a glimmer of validation. But the nightmares persisted. They grew more vivid, more invasive. In one dream, I found myself strapped to a cold metal table, surrounded by the same tall, thin figures. They communicated without words, their intentions unclear but undeniably sinister. The dreams felt less like dreams and more like memories, fragments of something too horrifying to fully grasp. The mark on my arm began to fade, but the sense of unease remained. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next encounter. The stress took its toll on my mental and physical health. I lost weight, my hair began to thin, and my once vibrant eyes now held a constant look of fear. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a familiar paralysis wash over me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The room grew cold, and the low hum filled my ears once again. I knew what was coming, and my heart pounded in my chest. The blinding light returned, and I felt myself being lifted from the bed. The sensation was both terrifying and oddly familiar. I was taken back to the clearing, back to the metallic object. This time, there was no escape. The figures surrounded me, their large eyes staring into mine. They communicated through images, flashes of other worlds, other beings. I was overwhelmed, unable to process the flood of information. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But this time, I wasn't alone. The figure stood at the foot of my bed, watching me. Its presence was both menacing and oddly comforting, as if it had been with me all along. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew it would be back. The mark on my arm had returned, brighter and more pronounced. I knew then that I was marked, chosen for reasons beyond my understanding. I moved to a new city, changed my name, and tried to start fresh. But no matter where I went, the feeling of being watched followed me. I'd see the figure in my dreams, in reflections, in the shadows of my new home. I've tried to live a normal life, but the encounters have left me scarred in ways that can't be seen. Every night, as I lie in bed, I wait for the blinding light, for the paralysis to take hold. I wait for the figures to return, knowing that this is my reality now. People ask me why I'm so paranoid, why I always seem on edge. I can't tell them the truth. They wouldn't believe me, they'd think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And I know that the encounters are far from over, so if you ever find yourself alone in the woods and the forest goes silent, run. Don't investigate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because once you've been marked, there's no escaping it. You'll be forever haunted by the unknown, by the figures that watch from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, aliens, and conspiracy theories, none of it ever intrigued me. I was a realist, grounded in facts and evidence. But after what happened last summer, my entire perspective changed. I feel the need to share this story, not to convince anyone, but as a form of catharsis and perhaps as a warning. It all began when I moved into a new apartment building in a relatively quiet part of the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and conveniently located near my office. The building itself was old with a bit of a rundown charm, and the landlord was an elderly man named Mr. Elkins. He was friendly enough, though there was something about him that seemed a little off, like he was hiding something. My first few weeks in the building were uneventful. I got to know a few of the neighbors, an elderly couple on the third floor, a single mom with her young son on the second, and a young couple who lived right across the hall from me. We exchanged pleasantries, but I mostly kept to myself. One night, as I was returning home late from work, I noticed a strange, almost sickly sweet odor in the hallway. It was faint, but it lingered in the air. I shrugged it off, attributing it to perhaps a trash bag left out too long, but over the next few days the smell grew stronger. It became almost unbearable, permeating through the walls and into my apartment. I decided to mention it to Mr. Elkins. He listened, nodding thoughtfully, but his response was dismissive.
"It's an old building, son. Sometimes the pipes can cause a bit of a stink. I'll have it checked out."
I didn't push the issue further, though his response left me feeling uneasy. That night I was jolted awake by the sound of something, or someone, moving in the hallway. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened intently. There it was again, a soft shuffling sound like dragging feet. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against it. The noise continued, now accompanied by a faint, raspy whispering. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone sent chills down my spine. Gathering my courage, I slowly opened the door a crack and peered into the hallway. It was empty. I stood there for a few moments, straining to hear anything else, but the noises had stopped. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I closed the door and returned to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The following morning, I bumped into the young couple from across the hall. They looked tired and anxious.
"Did you hear anything strange last night?"
The guy, Mark, asked. I hesitated, but then nodded. "Yeah, some weird noises in the hallway. Did you hear it too?" His girlfriend, Lisa, nodded vigorously.
"It was creepy, like someone was walking around whispering. We tried to call the landlord, but he didn't pick up."
We all agreed to keep an eye out and let each other know if anything else happened. That day at work, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The smell, the noises, it all felt wrong. That evening, as I was heading back to my apartment, I saw Mr. Elkins talking to a man in a suit. They were standing by the entrance, speaking in hushed tones. As I approached, they abruptly stopped talking and turned to look at me. There was something unsettling about the way they both stared, like they were sizing me up.
"Good evening,"
Mr. Elkins said with a tight smile.
"This is Mr. Rourke, friend of mine."
I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. Mr. Rourke's eyes were cold and piercing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was scrutinizing me. "Nice to meet you," I said, eager to get away from their gaze. I hurried past them and into the building, the unsettling encounter leaving me on edge. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder and more distinct. The shuffling feet, the raspy whispers, they seemed to be coming from right outside my door. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet and approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the doorknob, a sudden loud thud echoed through the hallway, followed by a blood-curdling scream. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed with fear. The scream was abruptly cut off, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there, bat in hand, trying to summon the courage to open the door. After what felt like an eternity, I finally swung the door open and stepped into the hallway. It was empty, but the air was thick with that sickly sweet odor. I moved cautiously down the hall, following the scent. It led me to a door at the end of the hallway, the door to the basement. I had never been down there before, and the thought of descending into the dark, musty basement filled me with dread. I gripped the bat tighter and opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. The smell was overpowering now, making me gag. I forced myself to descend the narrow staircase, my heart racing with each step. The basement was dimly lit, the flickering light bulb casting eerie shadows on the walls. I moved forward, the smell growing stronger with each step. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, lying on the floor, was Mark. His body was twisted and contorted, his eyes wide open in terror. A pool of blood surrounded him, and the source of the sickly sweet odor became horrifyingly clear. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What the hell had happened here? I turned to run, but my path was blocked by Mr. Elkins and Mr. Rourke. They stood at the bottom of the stairs, their expressions devoid of emotion.
Going somewhere?
Mr. Rourke asked, his voice cold and mocking. I raised the bat, ready to defend myself, but before I could react, Mr. Elkins lunged at me with surprising speed. He knocked the bat from my hands and pinned me against the wall.
You shouldn't have come down here,
he hissed, his breath hot against my face. Mr. Rourke approached, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light.
You've seen too much,
he said softly.
We can't let you leave.
Panic surged through me, and I struggled against Mr. Elkins' grip, but he was unnaturally strong. Mr. Rourke reached into his pocket and pulled out a syringe filled with a dark, viscous liquid.
Relax,
he said, smiling.
This will all be over soon.
I thrashed wildly, trying to break free, but it was no use. Mr. Rourke injected the liquid into my arm, and almost immediately a wave of dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred, and I felt my legs give out beneath me. The last thing I saw before darkness consumed me was Mr. Rourke's cold reptilian eyes staring into mine. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. My head was pounding, and my body felt weak and sluggish. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my mind. Had it all been a nightmare? But as I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I noticed a small puncture mark on my arm where the syringe had been. My heart sank as the realization hit me. Whatever had happened last night was real. I quickly dressed and went to check on Lisa. When she didn't answer her door, I broke it down. The apartment was in disarray, and there was no sign of her. I frantically searched every room, but she was gone. I ran to the landlord's office, but it was empty. Desperate, I went to the police. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said Mark's death was a freak accident, and there was no evidence of foul play. They chalked it up to my imagination and the stress of moving to a new place. Feeling defeated, I returned to my apartment. The building felt different now, darker, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every night the noises in the hallway continued. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and moved out the next day. I tried to put the experience behind me, but the nightmares persisted. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of Mark's twisted body and Mr. Rourke's reptilian eyes haunting my dreams. Months later, I decided to do some research. I needed answers, closure. I discovered that the building had a dark history. Over the years, numerous tenants had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The police never found any evidence, and the cases went cold. I dug deeper and found conspiracy theories about reptilian shapeshifters, beings that could disguise themselves as humans and prey on unsuspecting victims. It sounded absurd, but after what I had experienced, I couldn't dismiss it entirely. I've since moved to a new city, far away from that cursed building. But the fear lingers. I still look over my shoulder, wary of every stranger I pass. The world doesn't feel safe anymore, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. So, if you ever find yourself in an old, run-down building with a sickly sweet smell lingering in the air, be careful. I've always been an outdoorsman. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, the forest was my playground. As a kid, I'd spend countless hours exploring the woods behind our house, imagining myself as an intrepid explorer. So, when my friend Eric suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the Cascade Range, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We set off on a Friday morning. our car packed with gear and provisions. The drive was long, but the scenic beauty of the mountains kept our spirits high. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning its descent, casting an orange glow over the landscape. We hoisted our backpacks and started the hike to our campsite, about 5 miles into the forest. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp near a small, crystal-clear lake, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. As night fell, we built a fire, cooked our dinner, and shared stories under the starlit sky. The peacefulness of the wilderness was intoxicating, a perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. The next day, we decided to explore further into the forest. We followed a narrow, winding trail that seemed less traveled. The deeper we went, the denser the forest became. The air grew cooler and the light dimmer as the canopy overhead thickened. We were miles from any human habitation, enveloped by the sounds of nature. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon something strange. In a small clearing, we found a large, crude structure made of branches and leaves. It looked like a primitive shelter, but who would build such a thing out here? Eric and I exchanged puzzled glances, but our curiosity won. We approached cautiously, examining the construction. The branches were woven together in a way that seemed almost purposeful, yet haphazard at the same time. As we stood there, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. I felt a growing unease, like we were being watched. Eric must have sensed it too, because he suggested we head back to camp. That night, we couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The woods, which had seemed so welcoming before, now felt oppressive, almost sinister. We tried to laugh it off, attributing our jitters to overactive imaginations. But deep down, we both knew something was off. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear more. The growl came again, closer this time. My heart almost blew up. I nudged Eric awake and whispered that something was outside. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously unzipped the tent. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. We scanned the darkness, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the night. And then we saw it. Standing at the edge of our camp was a massive figure, at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its eyes glowed a menacing red in the light of our flashlights. For a moment, we were frozen in terror, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. This was no bear or mountain lion. This was something else, something primal, something legendary. Eric was the first to react, shouting at the creature and waving his arms in an attempt to scare it off. But the creature didn't budge. It just stood there, staring at us with those unblinking eyes. Then, with a terrifying roar, it charged. We scrambled back into the tent, grabbing whatever we could find to defend ourselves. The creature slammed into the side of the tent, sending us sprawling. Its powerful hands tore through the fabric, and we knew we had to get out of there. We bolted from the tent, running blindly into the woods. The creature was right behind us, crashing through the underbrush with frightening speed. We ran for what felt like hours, our lungs burning, our legs ready to give out. Finally, we found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine. There was nowhere left to run. I turned to face the creature, looking for a solution. Eric stood beside me, clutching a large stick. The creature stopped a few feet away, its breath ragged, its eyes burning with rage. For a moment I thought this was the end. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature hesitated. It looked past us, towards the ravine, and its expression changed. Fear. It was afraid of something. Before I could process what was happening, the ground beneath us gave way. Eric and I tumbled down the ravine, landing in a heap at the bottom. Bruised and battered, we struggled to our feet. The creature was gone, but we could still hear its growls echoing through the forest. We had to keep moving. We made our way down the ravine, following a small stream that led us back to familiar territory. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was rising. We quickly packed up our gear and hiked back to the trailhead, constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just days before, now felt like a hostile, alien world. We didn't speak much on the drive home, both of us lost in our thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red eyes, heard that guttural growl. I tried to rationalize what we had seen, but no explanation made sense. Bigfoot was supposed to be a myth, a legend, but I knew what I had seen. It was real. The following weeks were a blur. Eric and I agreed not to tell anyone about our encounter. Who would believe us? We didn't want to be labeled as crazy or attention seekers, but the experience left a mark on us. We stopped going on camping trips, avoided the forest altogether. The fear lingered, a constant reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the trees. Months passed, and I tried to move on with my life, but the nightmares persisted. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my mind replaying that night over and over. I became obsessed with learning more about Bigfoot, scouring the internet for stories and sightings. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. There were countless accounts of encounters, some eerily similar to ours. People described the same glowing red eyes, the same guttural growl. It was clear we were not alone in our experience. One night, while researching online, I came across a forum dedicated to Bigfoot sightings. I hesitated, but decided to share our story, hoping to find some answers or at least some solace in knowing we weren't alone. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people reached out, sharing their own encounters, offering support and advice. Among the messages, one stood out. It was from a man named Tom, who claimed to be a Bigfoot researcher. He had spent years studying the creature and had even had his own encounter years ago. He believed that Bigfoot was not just an animal, but something more, something supernatural. Tom suggested that our encounter might have been a warning. He believed that Bigfoot was a guardian of the forest, protecting it from those who would do it harm. He theorized that our intrusion into its territory had triggered a defensive response, but he also warned that once you've seen Bigfoot, it never forgets you. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the creature was still out there, waiting. The nightmares intensified, and I started to see shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, avoiding the woods at all costs. Then, one night, it happened. I was home alone, trying to relax after another sleepless night. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock. Suddenly I heard a noise outside, a low guttural growl. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window. Peering out into the darkness, I saw nothing. But the growling continued, growing louder, more menacing. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I had to get out. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the door, but as I stepped outside, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the porch light, was the creature. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. I froze, really. The creature took a step forward, and I could feel its gaze locked on me. I knew I had to act fast. I jumped into my car and sped down the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature watching me, its eyes burning with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to put as much distance between myself and the creature as possible. Eventually, I found myself at a motel on the outskirts of town. Exhausted and shaken, I checked in and collapsed onto the bed, hoping for some semblance of rest. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside, sent me into a panic. I felt trapped, cornered by an unseen threat. The weight of the encounter bore down on me, suffocating any sense of safety or normalcy. As dawn broke, I knew I couldn't continue like this. I needed help. I reached out to Tom, explaining what had happened. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort and advice. He suggested I come to his cabin deep in the woods of Oregon. It seemed counterintuitive, heading back into the forest after what had happened. But Tom assured me his place was a sanctuary. He believed he could help me understand what I had experienced, and perhaps even find a way to end the nightmare that had taken over my life. With nowhere else to turn, I agreed. I packed a bag, left a note for Eric, and set off on the long drive to Oregon. The journey was grueling, my mind replaying the events of that fateful night over and over. By the time I reached Tom's cabin, I was a bundle of nerves, my paranoia heightened by the dense woods surrounding his isolated home. Tom greeted me warmly, his demeanor calm and reassuring. He was an older man, his face weathered by years spent in the wilderness. Despite his grizzled appearance, there was a kindness in his eyes that put me at ease, if only slightly. He led me inside, where the walls were lined with books, maps, and various artifacts related to Bigfoot. It was clear he had dedicated his life to understanding the creature. We spent the next few hours talking, Tom patiently listening to my story and asking insightful questions. He explained his theory that Bigfoot was not just an animal, but a guardian spirit of the forest, an ancient being with a deep connection to the land. According to Tom, those who encountered Bigfoot were often marked in some way, chosen for reasons beyond their understanding. The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. Tom believed that my encounter had triggered something within the creature, a sense of recognition, or perhaps even a test. He offered to perform a ritual that he believed would help me sever the connection and find peace. Desperate for any solution, I agreed. That night, under the light of a full moon, Tom led me into the forest behind his cabin. We followed a narrow path to a small clearing, where he had set up a circle of stones. In the center was a fire pit, the flames flickering and casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Tom instructed me to sit by the fire, close my eyes, and focus on my breathing. He began to chant in a language I didn't understand, his voice low and rhythmic. The air grew heavy, and I felt a strange energy wash over me. Tom's chanting grew louder, more intense, and the flames of the fire seemed to dance in response. I felt a presence, something ancient and powerful, watching us from the darkness. Suddenly, the fire flared up, and I heard a guttural growl, the same sound that had haunted my nightmares. I opened my eyes and saw the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing red with an unnatural light. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped by the intensity of the moment. Tom continued to chant, his voice unwavering. The creature took a step forward, then another, until it was standing just a few feet away. I could see every detail of its massive form, the matted hair, the powerful muscles, the intelligence in its eyes. It raised its arms, and I braced myself for the worst. But instead of attacking, the creature stopped. It looked at me, its expression inscrutable. For a moment, we were locked in a silent exchange, a connection that transcended words. Then, with a final deafening roar, the creature turned and disappeared into the forest. The fire died down, and the heavy energy lifted. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted and shaken. Tom knelt beside me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He explained that the ritual had been successful, that I had faced the creature and survived. The connection was broken, and I was free. I spent the next few days at Tom's cabin, recovering and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Tom was a patient and wise guide, helping me process the experience and understand the deeper implications. By the time I left, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. Returning home, I found that the nightmares had stopped. The paranoia faded, replaced by a newfound appreciation for the mysteries of the world. I reconnected with Eric, and we talked about our experience, finding solace in the shared understanding of what we had gone through. Life slowly returned to normal, but the encounter had changed me in profound ways. I couldn't forget what I had seen, what I had felt. The forest, once a place of adventure and exploration, now held a deeper, more complex significance. I knew that Bigfoot was out there, not just a myth, but a living, breathing guardian of the wilderness. Years passed, and I continued to explore the woods, though with a newfound respect and caution. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of that night remained vivid in my mind. It was a reminder of the unknown, the unseen forces that shape our world in ways we can't always comprehend. One day, I received a letter from Tom. It was brief, a simple note thanking me for trusting him and sharing my story. He mentioned that he was still researching, still seeking answers. There was a postscript, a single line that sent a chill down my spine. Remember, the forest never forgets. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, feeling a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I knew that my encounter with Bigfoot was a rare and extraordinary experience, one that had changed my life forever. The fear had faded, but the respect remained. And as I sat there, reflecting on my journey, I realized that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The legend of Bigfoot was more than just a story. It was a testament to the wild, untamed spirit of the world we live in. A reminder that no matter how much we think we know, there is always something lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding, waiting to reveal itself to those who dare to venture into the unknown. I always considered myself a skeptic, dismissing most supernatural tales as mere folklore or the products of overactive imaginations. My friends and I would often share these stories, laughing them off as nothing more than campfire entertainment. But one encounter changed everything I believed about the world around us. This is the story of my run-in with the Dogman, a creature I once thought was nothing more than a myth. It was a cool evening in late September when my friends and I decided to go camping in the forests of northern Michigan. We had chosen a secluded spot deep within the woods, far away from the usual camping sites. It was the perfect location for an uninterrupted weekend getaway. We were equipped with everything we needed: tents, food, and enough firewood to keep us warm throughout the chilly nights. As the sun began to set, we set up camp and lit a bonfire. The night was filled with laughter, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional howl of distant wildlife. We were miles away from civilization, and the only light came from our fire and the stars above. After hours of storytelling and roasting marshmallows, we decided to call it a night. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of rustling leaves and twigs snapping outside my tent. Initially, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal passing through the area. But as the noises grew closer and more deliberate, a sense of unease crept over me. I reached for my flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent flap. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. I scanned the area, my pulse quickening. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing about 20 feet away was a tall, shadowy figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was anything but human. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes reflected the light from my flashlight with an eerie glow. It stood upright, like a man, but its head was distinctly canine, with pointed ears and a long snout. I had heard stories of the Michigan Dogman before, but seeing it in person was far more terrifying than any tale. Frozen in fear, I watched as the creature sniffed the air and took a step closer. Its movements were fluid and calculated, like a predator stalking its prey. I knew I had to act fast. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof of what I was seeing. But as soon as I raised it to take a picture, the Dogman let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. Panicking, I dropped the camera and scrambled back into my tent, zipping it up as quickly as I could. I could hear the creature circling the campsite, its heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My friends, now awake, whispered frantically, asking what was going on. I told them to stay quiet and still, hoping the Dogman would lose interest and leave. Minutes felt like hours as we sat in terrified silence, listening to the creature's movements. Eventually, the sounds grew fainter, and we dared to peek outside. The Dogman was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. We decided to pack up and leave immediately, abandoning our plans for the rest of the weekend. As we drove away from the campsite, the encounter replayed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come dangerously close to something beyond our understanding. Over the next few days, I researched the Dogman and discovered that our encounter was not unique. There were numerous reports of sightings across Michigan and other parts of the United States, each one more chilling than the last. One story I came across involved a man named Robert Fortney, who encountered the Dogman near the Haymarsh State Game Area in 1961. According to his account, he saw a 6-foot-tall, upright canine creature in his driveway late at night. Another report detailed the experiences of Lori Endrizi, who saw the Beast of Bray Road while driving near Elkhorn, Wisconsin. These stories, among others, confirmed that the Dogman was not just a figment of my imagination. Despite the fear and uncertainty, I felt a strange sense of validation. My encounter with the Dogman had shattered my skepticism and opened my eyes to the mysteries that lurk in the shadows. The following months after our encounter were a mix of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Every creak in the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window would send me into a panic. I had become hyper-aware of my surroundings, always expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. My friends and I kept in touch, sharing updates on our lives and our attempts to move past that night. But it was clear that none of us were the same. One evening, about 6 months after our encounter, I received a call from my friend, Mike. His voice was shaky, almost whispering as he spoke. He told me that he had seen the Dogman again. This time, it was near his home, just outside the city. He had been driving back from work late at night when he saw the creature standing by the side of the road. It watched him as he drove past, its eyes reflecting the headlights of his car. Mike was terrified, and his fear reignited my own. Determined to find some answers, I began reaching out to others who had reported sightings of the Dogman. I joined online forums and attended meetings of the North American Dogman Project, a group dedicated to investigating and documenting Dogman encounters. Through these connections, I learned about other sightings and encounters, each one more disturbing than the last. One particularly chilling story came from a woman named Jo, who had multiple encounters with the Dogman over several years. Her most terrifying experience occurred when the creature tried to break into her home during a stormy night. She and her boyfriend had barricaded themselves in the bathroom, listening in horror as the Dogman ripped through the walls of the house. The sheer terror in her voice as she recounted her story left no doubt in my mind that these encounters were real. Another account that stood out was from a group of young adults traveling through Texas. They described seeing a pitch-black Great Dane running at an abnormal speed before it stopped in the middle of the road, stood up on 2 feet, and walked across the road like a human. The sheer strangeness of their experience mirrored my own, reinforcing the reality of what we had seen. These stories, along with my own encounter, painted a picture of a creature that was intelligent, elusive, and incredibly dangerous. It seemed to have a particular interest in certain individuals, following them and reappearing in their lives. The more I learned, the more I realized that our initial encounter was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of sightings and experiences. As time went on, I began to notice changes in myself. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and more fearful of the dark. The Dogman had left a mark on me, one that couldn't be easily erased. My friends experienced similar changes, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own ways. Some sought therapy, others turned to faith, and some, like me, dove deeper into the mystery, searching for answers. One night, almost a year after our encounter, I decided to return to the site where we had seen the Dogman. I needed closure, a way to face my fears and move forward. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a sense of determination, I made my way back to the forest. As I approached the campsite, memories of that night flooded back, but I pushed through, determined to confront whatever awaited me. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional hoot of an owl. I reached the spot where we had set up camp and stood there, taking in the silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had faced my fear and emerged unscathed. But then, I heard it, a low growl, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. My heart raced as I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the Dogman. It was exactly as I remembered. Tall, covered in matted fur, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. But this time there was something different. It seemed more menacing, more intent on making its presence known. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The Dogman took a step forward, its growl growing louder. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof of what I was seeing. But as I raised it, the creature lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I felt its claws digging into my shoulder, its hot breath on my face. In that moment, I thought I was going to die. But just as quickly as it had attacked, the Dogman retreated, disappearing into the forest. I lay there, stunned and bleeding, trying to process what had just happened. It had let me go. But why? As I made my way back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the Dogman had let me live for a reason. The encounter left me with more questions than answers, and a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Back home, I cleaned and dressed my wounds, and the physical pain served as a reminder of how real the experience had been. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The Dogman was more than just a myth or a legend. It was a living, breathing entity with an intelligence and malice that defied explanation. I decided to document everything that had happened to me, from the first sighting to the most recent attack. I wanted to create a record, not just for myself, but for others who might encounter this creature in the future. I reached out to experts in cryptozoology, hoping to gain some insight into the Dogman's behavior and origins. Their theories ranged from the plausible to the outlandish. Some believed the Dogman was a previously unknown species of upright canine, while others suggested it might be a supernatural entity, perhaps even a shapeshifter or a skinwalker. The lack of concrete evidence only fueled my determination to uncover the truth. Despite the mounting evidence, I struggled to find a way to protect myself and others from the Dogman. Conventional weapons seemed ineffective, and the creature's intelligence made it a formidable adversary. I considered moving away, starting fresh in a place far from the woods of Michigan. But I knew deep down that running wouldn't solve the problem. The Dogman had marked me in some way, and it wouldn't be long before it found me again. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a familiar rustling outside my window. I froze, listening intently as the sounds grew closer. I could feel the Dogman's presence, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to fill the room. I knew it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. In a desperate attempt to defend myself, I grabbed a baseball bat and crept towards the window. the creature's glowing eyes met mine through the glass, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I felt a surge of anger and defiance, determined not to be a victim any longer. I swung the bat with all my might, shattering the window and sending shards of glass flying. The Dogman let out a howl of rage and pain, retreating into the darkness. I stood there, breathless and trembling, realizing that I had finally fought back. The victory was small, but it gave me a glimmer of hope. I knew that the battle was far from over, but I had taken the first step towards reclaiming my life. I contacted a group of paranormal investigators, hoping to enlist their help in confronting the Dogman. They agreed to come to my home, equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and other tools to capture evidence of the creature. The night of the investigation was tense and filled with anticipation. We set up cameras around the perimeter of the house and waited in silence, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Dogman. Hours passed with no sign of the creature, and I began to wonder if it had decided to leave me alone. But just as we were about to call it a night, we heard a series of low growls coming from the woods. The investigators sprang into action, directing their cameras towards the sound. I watched the monitors, my heart pounding as the growls grew louder and more aggressive. Suddenly, one of the cameras picked up movement, and there it was, the Dogman, lurking at the edge of the clearing. It was more menacing than ever, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. The creature circled the house, occasionally glancing towards the cameras, as if it knew exactly what we were doing. The investigators whispered excitedly, capturing footage that would serve as undeniable proof of the Dogman's existence. But as the night wore on, the creature's behavior became more erratic. It began to pace back and forth, growling and snarling, its eyes fixed on me through the monitors. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the Dogman wasn't just an animal. It was something far more sinister. It seemed to understand our intentions, and it wasn't pleased. The air grew thick with tension, and I knew we had pushed our luck too far. The lead investigator, sensing the danger, suggested we pack up and leave immediately. As we hurriedly gathered our equipment, the Dogman let out a deafening howl, charging towards the house with a speed and ferocity that took us all by surprise. We barely had time to react as it crashed through the front door, its massive form filling the room. The investigators scattered, some of them screaming in terror as they fled into the night. I stood my ground, clutching the baseball bat, determined not to let the creature win. Dogman lunged at me, its claws raking across my arm. I swung the bat with all my strength, striking the creature's head. It yelped in pain, but quickly recovered, its eyes burning with rage. I braced myself for another attack, but the creature suddenly stopped, its ears perking up as if it had heard something. In the distance, I could hear the sound of sirens approaching. The Dogman hesitated, its gaze shifting between me and the door. With a final menacing growl, it turned and bolted out of the house, disappearing into the darkness just as the police arrived. The investigators and I were left shaken and bruised, but alive. But the surprise came when I reviewed the footage with the investigators, piecing together the events of that night. Despite of everything that happened, the cameras did not capture any clear images and audio of the Dogman. The footage was impressive, but you barely could see the creature or anything else besides the screaming and the confusion. Having miserably failed to prove its existence, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Dogman would return. It was out there, somewhere, watching and waiting. The battle was far from over, and I knew that I had to stay vigilant. I fortified my home, installing security systems and motion-activated lights, and I kept a weapon within reach at all times. This damn creature had left its mark on me, both physically and mentally. I carried the scars of our encounters, a constant reminder of the creature's power and malice. But I also carried a sense of purpose, a determination to protect myself and others from the unknown dangers that lurked in the shadows. As I write this, I can still feel its presence, a lurking shadow in the corner of my mind. The encounter was more than just a brush with the supernatural. It was a reminder of the fragile line between reality and the unknown. Even not being able to prove it, I can say, the Dogman is real, and it's out there, watching and waiting. And so am I, ready to confront whatever comes next. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town near California's Santa Lucia Mountains, I spent countless weekends hiking, camping, and exploring the rugged terrain. But one experience, a harrowing encounter I still struggle to comprehend, changed my relationship with those mountains forever. It was late September, just as the summer heat began to wane, giving way to cooler, crisper air. My friends, Will and May and I decided to take one last trip before the winter rains made the trails too muddy and dangerous. We planned a 3-day hike through a lesser-known section of the range, a path that promised stunning vistas and the solitude we craved. On the first day, everything went smoothly. We set up camp by a small, pristine lake nestled between two peaks. As night fell, we gathered around a fire, trading stories and enjoying the serene silence of the wilderness. Little did we know, our peaceful retreat was about to become a nightmare. The second day began early, with the sun just starting to peek over the horizon. We packed up and continued our trek, aiming to reach a high ridge that offered panoramic views of the entire range. By midday, we were deep into the forest, the dense canopy above blocking out much of the sunlight. That's when we first felt it, the unsettling sensation of being watched. I glanced at May and saw her furrowed brow.
Do you feel that?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
Yeah,
Will replied, his eyes scanning the trees around us.
it's like we're not alone.
We tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to our imaginations running wild in the isolated wilderness. But as we pressed on, the sense of unease grew stronger. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt oppressive, as if the very trees were closing in on us. By late afternoon, we reached the ridge. The view was breathtaking, with rolling hills and valleys stretching out as far as the eye could see. We took a moment to rest, hoping the beauty of the landscape would dispel the eerie feeling that had been following us. As we sat there, I noticed something on a distant hilltop, a dark figure standing motionless against the sky. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I squinted, I could make out more details. The figure was tall and cloaked, its features obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. I nudged Will and pointed it out. "What do you think that is?" I asked. Will pulled out his binoculars and focused on the figure.
I don't know. Maybe another hiker?
May, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up.
It's not moving, and there's something off about it.
We watched for several minutes, but the figure remained perfectly still. Unease turned to dread as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. We decided to make camp a little further down the ridge, hoping to put some distance between us and the mysterious figure. That night, as we huddled around the campfire, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set our nerves on edge. May suggested we tell some ghost stories to lighten the mood, but each tale only served to amplify our anxiety. Eventually, we turned in for the night, though sleep was elusive. I lay in my tent, staring up at the fabric ceiling, every sound outside magnified in the stillness. Sometime in the early hours, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering. It seemed to come from all around us, the voices merging into an incomprehensible murmur. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, stepping into the cold night air. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light. I saw Will and May standing by the edge of the camp, their eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed their gaze and felt my blood run cold. The dark figure was back, closer this time, standing on the edge of the clearing. It was still as a statue, its features hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, piercing and malevolent, boring into us. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice trembling. Will and May nodded, too frightened to argue. We quickly packed up our gear, moving as silently as possible. As we prepared to leave, I glanced back at the figure. It hadn't moved, but I could sense its presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on us. We hiked through the night, guided by the dim light of our headlamps. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. The whispering followed us, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if the very air was alive with voices, each one telling us to turn back, to give in to the darkness. By dawn, we were exhausted, but had put considerable distance between us and the ridge. We found a small, sheltered glade and collapsed, too tired to care about anything but rest. As I drifted off, I prayed that the figure wouldn't follow us. The third day was a blur of fatigue and fear. We moved as quickly as our tired bodies would allow, desperate to reach the trailhead and the safety of our car. But the forest seemed to conspire against us, the path twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. More than once, we found ourselves backtracking, as if we were caught in a maze. Late in the afternoon, we stumbled upon an old, weathered sign pointing to a ranger station. Hope surged through us, and we quickened our pace. But as we neared the station, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent than before. The ranger station was a dilapidated building, long abandoned. Windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. But it was shelter, and at that moment, we needed to feel safe, even if it was an illusion. We entered the building and barricaded the door as best we could. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of decay. We found a corner to huddle in, our backs to the wall, and waited for the whispering to stop. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke to May's scream. My heart lurched as I saw her standing by the window, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Outside, barely visible in the moonlight, were dozens of dark figures, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. They surrounded the station, motionless and silent, their eyes fixed on us. Will and I rushed to her side, but there was nowhere to run. We were trapped, the shadows closing in. The whispering reached a fever pitch, the voices merging into a cacophony of dread. In that moment, I knew we wouldn't escape. Those things had claimed us. The next morning, a search party found us, wandering aimlessly near the trailhead. We had no memory of how we got there, our minds a haze of terror and confusion. The rangers said we were lucky to be alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of us had been left behind in those mountains. Days that followed our return were a blur. May, Will, and I were in a state of shock. We tried to rationalize what we had seen, but there was no logical explanation. Our friends and families were supportive, but I could see the doubt in their eyes when we recounted our story. To them, it was just a figment of our overactive imaginations, a product of exhaustion and fear in the wilderness. But we knew the truth. Those beings probably had marked us. I struggled to return to normal life. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every whisper carried the ominous undertones of that dreadful night. May and Will fared no better. We kept in touch, bonded by our shared trauma, but our conversations were strained, haunted by the memories we couldn't escape. A few weeks later, I received a call from Will. He sounded frantic, his voice barely a whisper.
I saw one,
He said.
outside my window. I swear it was there watching me.
I tried to calm him down, but the fear in his voice was undeniable. We agreed to meet the next day, but Will never showed up. His parents reported him missing, and a search party was organized. Days turned into weeks, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. May and I were devastated. We clung to each other for support, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. One night, as we sat in my living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, May suddenly froze. Her eyes were wide with terror as she stared at the window.
They're here.
She whispered. I turned to look and saw them. Dark figures standing just beyond the glass, their forms barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as I grabbed May's hand, pulling her away from the window. We retreated to the basement, locking the door behind us. The whispering started again, a low, insistent murmur that seemed to come from the very walls. We stayed in the basement until dawn, too afraid to move. When we finally emerged, the figures were gone, but the fear remained. We knew we couldn't stay here. They had found us, and they wouldn't stop until they had claimed us all. Desperate for answers, I began researching similar cases to understand what were those things. I scoured old books, local legends, and obscure internet forums, searching for anything that might help us. Finally, I found what we were dealing with. People called them the Dark Watchers, ancient beings that had roamed these mountains for centuries, observing, waiting. Some said they were guardians, others claimed they were harbingers of doom. The stories were varied, but they all had one thing in common. Once the Dark Watchers marked you, there was no escape. I found accounts of hikers and campers who had seen the Watchers, felt their oppressive gaze. Some had gone missing, never to be seen again. Others had been found, wandering aimlessly, their minds shattered by the experience. The more I read, the more hopeless our situation seemed. One night, as I was poring over an old book in the local library, an elderly man approached me. He introduced himself as Thomas, a retired park ranger who had spent his life in the Santa Lucia Mountains. He had heard my story from one of the rangers who found us and had been looking for me ever since. Thomas told me that he had encountered the Dark Watchers once, many years ago. He had been on a routine patrol when he saw them, standing on a distant ridge. He felt their gaze, the oppressive weight of their presence, but he had managed to escape by sheer luck. He had spent his life trying to understand them, to find a way to protect himself and others from their malevolent influence. He believed that the Dark Watchers were ancient beings, tied to the land in ways we couldn't comprehend. They were neither good nor evil, but their presence was a harbinger of doom for those who saw them. He had found clues in old Native American legends and Spanish explorer accounts, but nothing concrete. The Watchers were elusive, their motives inscrutable. Thomas offered to help us, but his advice was grim.
There's no way to fight them,
he said.
The best you can do is avoid them. Stay away from the mountains. If they've marked you, you need to keep moving. Never stay in one place for too long.
May and I took his advice to heart. We packed up our belongings and left town, drifting from place to place, never staying more than a few days. But no matter where we went, the Watchers were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Weeks turned into months, and our lives became a constant cycle of fear and flight. We lost touch with our families, our friends, everyone we had once known. The Watchers had taken everything from us, leaving us with nothing but our shared terror. One day, as we were driving through a remote part of Oregon, our car broke down. It was late afternoon, and the nearest town was miles away. We had no choice but to walk, hoping to find help before nightfall. As we made our way through the dense forest, the familiar sense of being watched returned. We quickened our pace, but it was no use. The whispering started again, the voices more insistent than ever. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest was plunged into darkness. We stumbled through the underbrush, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. Suddenly, May stopped. She turned to me, her face pale and eyes wide with fear.
I can't do this anymore,
she said.
They're never going to stop. We can't keep running forever.
I tried to reassure her, but deep down I knew she was right. We were trapped in a never-ending nightmare, with no hope of escape. The Watchers would always find us, no matter where we went. As we stood there, surrounded by darkness, the figures emerged from the shadows. Dozens of them, their forms barely visible in the faint light. They closed in around us, their eyes gleaming with a cold, malevolent intelligence. We backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The Watchers formed a circle, trapping us in the center. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very earth beneath our feet. In that moment, I understood. The Watchers weren't just observers, they were hunters. and we were their prey. They had been toying with us, driving us to the brink of madness, savoring our fear. I held May's hand, and we faced the Watchers together. There was no point in running anymore. Our fate was sealed. The Watchers moved closer, their forms shifting and undulating in the darkness. The whispering reached a fever pitch, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. Everything went black. When I woke, I was alone. The forest was silent, the Watchers gone. May was nowhere to be found. I stumbled through the trees, calling her name, but there was no answer. She was gone, taken by the Watchers. I wandered for hours, lost and alone, until I found a road. A passing driver picked me up and took me to the nearest town. I was in a daze, barely able to comprehend what had happened. The police didn't believe my story. They chalked it up to a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and fear. But I knew the truth. The Watchers had claimed May, just as they had claimed Will, and it was only a matter of time before they came for me. I've spent the years since then in a state of constant vigilance, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over my shoulder. The Watchers are out there, waiting, watching, and I know that one day they will find me. When they do, I'll be ready. I won't run. I won't hide. I'll face them head on, and maybe, just maybe, I'll finally understand what they are and why they've chosen me. Until then, I live in fear, haunted by the whispering voices and the dark figures that lurk in the shadows. The Dark Watchers are real, and they're always watching. And if you ever find yourself in the Santa Lucia Mountains, remember this: if you see them, don't look away. Don't run. Because once you've seen the Dark Watchers, they never let you go. I grew up on the outskirts of a small town in New Mexico, surrounded by endless stretches of desert and dense patches of forest. My family owned a modest ranch, where I spent most of my childhood exploring the vast and eerie landscapes. The tranquility of the remote area was often interrupted by strange occurrences and unsettling local legends, the most terrifying of which was the legend of the Skinwalkers. It was a cool autumn evening when my encounter with the inexplicable began. I had returned home from college for a brief visit, eager to escape the stress of city life. My younger brother, Jake, had convinced me to take a walk with him into the woods behind our property. Jake had always been fascinated by the supernatural, often regaling me with tales of local folklore, but I dismissed them as mere stories to pass the time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground, we ventured deeper into the forest. The air was crisp, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot. We walked for what seemed like hours, discussing everything from school to our parents, when Jake suddenly stopped in his tracks.
Did you hear that?
He whispered, his voice trembling. I listened intently, but heard nothing out of the ordinary. Hear what? I asked, trying to sound unconcerned.
It sounded like someone calling my name,
Jake replied, his eyes scanning the darkening woods. I shrugged it off, attributing it to his overactive imagination. Probably just the wind, I said, but a sense of unease began to creep in. We continued walking, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. That's when we saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. It was tall and gaunt, with long matted hair and eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. Jake and I froze, staring at the figure in disbelief. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, stepping closer and revealing more of its grotesque form. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its limbs were elongated, its skin pallid, and stretched tight over its bones.
Run!
Jake shouted, breaking the spell of terror that had paralyzed us. We turned and sprinted back the way we came, branches scratching at our faces and arms as we crashed through the underbrush. I could hear the creature behind us, its footsteps heavy and relentless. We burst out of the woods and onto the open field near our house, but the sense of safety was fleeting. Jake stumbled and fell, and I skidded to a stop to help him up. As I reached out, I saw the creature emerge from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on us. I hauled Jake to his feet, and we bolted towards the house, not daring to look back. We slammed the door shut behind us and locked it, our breaths coming in desperate heaves. The house was dark and silent, offering little comfort against the terror we had just escaped. That night, as we sat in the living room, too afraid to sleep, Jake told me about the Skinwalker legends he had heard from our neighbors and friends. According to Navajo folklore, a Skinwalker was a malevolent witch who could transform into animals and mimic the voices of their victims to lure them away from safety. They were said to be nearly impossible to kill and capable of inflicting unimaginable terror and suffering. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. We rarely left the house, and when we did, it was only in broad daylight and never alone. The sense of being watched was constant, a chilling reminder of our encounter. One evening, as we sat on the porch, trying to convince ourselves that it was all in our heads, we saw it again. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching us. This time, it didn't move, didn't come closer. It simply stood there, a silent reminder that it was still there, waiting. Desperate for answers, we reached out to a local Navajo elder, hoping for some way to protect ourselves. The elder listened to our story with a grave expression, then told us that the only way to combat a Skinwalker was through powerful protective rituals and blessings. He performed a cleansing ceremony at our home, chanting in a language I didn't understand, but the words seemed to carry a weight and power that was almost palpable. He placed protective symbols around the house and warned us to stay vigilant. For a while, it seemed to work. The sightings stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched began to fade. But the sense of safety was short-lived. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping at my window. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, but the tapping grew more insistent. I got up and approached the window cautiously. As I pulled back the curtain, my heart sank. There, standing just outside, was the creature. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it began to mimic my voice, calling out for help in a chilling, distorted tone. I stumbled back, terrified, and grabbed the phone to call Jake. But as I dialed his number, I realized he was already standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn.
"It's here,"
he said simply. We gathered in the living room, too afraid to go back to our rooms. The creature continued to tap at the windows, its voice growing more desperate and insistent. It felt like it was trying to break us down, to wear us out, until we couldn't resist any longer. The next morning, we contacted the elder again, begging for his help. He arrived quickly, bringing with him more protective items and performing another, even more intense ritual. He warned us that the Skinwalker was persistent and that we needed to be strong and united to withstand its attacks. Days turned into weeks, and the creature's attempts to terrorize us became more sporadic, but no less frightening. It would appear at odd times, always just on the edge of our vision. One night, as we sat in the living room, exhausted and on edge, we heard a loud crash from the kitchen. We rushed in to find the back door wide open, the wind howling through the gap. The protective symbols the elder had placed were scattered across the floor, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. Jake grabbed a baseball bat, and I armed myself with a kitchen knife. We searched the house, room by room, but found nothing. As we returned to the living room, we saw it, the creature standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. It stepped into the room, its movements fluid and predatory. Jake swung the bat, but the creature dodged effortlessly, its eyes never leaving us. It lunged at Jake and I screamed, charging forward with the knife. The creature's skin was cold and leathery, and as I stabbed at it, it let out an ear-piercing screech. It recoiled, and for a moment I thought we had won. But then it straightened, its eyes blazing with fury. It seemed to grow larger, more menacing, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were outmatched. Just as it was about to strike again, the elder burst into the room chanting loudly. The creature froze, its eyes widening in fear. The elder continued his chant, moving closer, and the creature began to shrink back, its form flickering and distorting. With one final desperate screech, it turned and fled, disappearing into the night. The elder completed his ritual, and the oppressive feeling began to lift. He turned to us, his expression stern.
"This is not over,"
he said.
"The Skinwalker will return. You must remain strong and keep the protective symbols close. Do not let it break you."
We thanked him and promised to heed his advice. The next few days were tense, but the creature did not return. Slowly, we began to rebuild our lives, always wary, always prepared. Years have passed since that terrifying encounter, but the memory is still fresh in my mind. The forest that once felt like a safe haven now feels like a constant threat. We remain vigilant, always on guard, knowing that the Skinwalker could return at any moment. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I can almost hear it. A faint tapping at the window, a distant call in a distorted voice. We survived, but we are forever changed, marked by the knowledge that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I wish I could say that our story ended there, that the terror was behind us, but life has a way of reminding you that some nightmares are never truly over. About a year after our initial encounter, strange things began happening again. It started small. Doors left open that we were sure we had closed. Objects moving on their own. The faint smell of something burning in the middle of the night. Jake and I tried to rationalize these occurrences, convincing ourselves that it was just our imagination, the residual paranoia from our encounter with the Skinwalker. But deep down, we knew better. One evening, I was home alone, sitting in the living room and reading a book. The sun had just set, and the house was cloaked in a soft, orange glow. I had left the window open to let in the cool evening breeze. As I turned a page, I heard it again, a faint tapping at the window. My body went rigid with fear. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder and more insistent. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked towards the window. As I pulled back the curtain, I saw the creature again, its glowing eyes staring into mine. This time, it looked different. More decayed, almost skeletal, as if it had been rotting away over the past year. It opened its mouth and began to speak, mimicking my voice in a distorted, eerie tone.
"Let me in,"
it said, its voice sending chills down my spine. I stumbled back, horrified,
"Let me in,"
and grabbed the phone to call Jake. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial his number. When he answered, I could hear the fear in his voice as I told him what was happening.
"I'm on my way,"
he said, and I could hear the urgency in his voice.
"Let me in."
I hung up and backed away from the window, never taking my eyes off the creature.
"Let me in."
It continued to tap on the glass,
"Let me in."
its voice growing more desperate and insistent.
"Let me in."
The minutes felt like hours as I waited for Jake to arrive.
"Let me in."
When he finally burst through the front door, I felt a brief moment of relief. But that relief was short-lived. The creature had disappeared from the window, but we could still feel its presence, a heavy, oppressive weight in the air. We called the elder once again, begging for his help. He arrived quickly, his expression grim. He performed another cleansing ceremony, but this time it felt different. There was a sense of urgency and desperation in his actions, as if he knew that the creature was growing stronger. After the ceremony, the elder sat us down and told us that the Skinwalker was more powerful than he had initially thought. It had marked us, and it would continue to return, growing stronger each time.
"You must find a way to break the connection,"
he said.
"There is an old ritual, but it is dangerous and must be performed exactly as described. If you make a mistake, the consequences could be dire."
Desperate, we agreed to perform the ritual. The elder gave us detailed instructions and warned us that we would need to face our deepest fears and confront the creature head-on. That night, we prepared for the ritual. We gathered the necessary items and followed the elder's instructions to the letter. As midnight approached, we began the ritual, chanting the ancient words and invoking the protective spirits. The air grew cold, and the room was filled with an unnatural darkness. The creature appeared, its form shifting and flickering in the shadows. It lunged at us, but we held our ground, continuing to chant and focus on the protective symbols. The creature screamed in rage, its form distorting and twisting in the darkness. I could feel its anger, its desperation to break free and attack us. But we held strong, pouring all of our energy into the ritual. Finally, with one last deafening screech, the creature was banished. The darkness lifted, and the room was filled with a soft, comforting light. We had done it. We had broken the connection. The elder praised our bravery and told us that we were finally free. The Skinwalker would not return. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, we felt truly safe. Life slowly returned to normal. The strange occurrences stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched faded away. Jake and I resumed our daily routines, but the memory of our encounters with the Skinwalker never left us. We remained vigilant, always on guard, but the terror that had haunted us for so long was finally over. We had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, stronger and more united than ever before. Years passed, and we moved on with our lives. Jake got married and started a family, while I pursued my career and traveled the world. But every so often, when the wind howls through the trees or the night is unusually still, I am reminded of the Skinwalker and the horrors we faced. I know that true evil exists in this world, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But I also know that we have the strength to face it and overcome it, no matter how terrifying it may be. And so, our story continues, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of courage in the face of unimaginable terror. We survived, and we will always be prepared for whatever darkness may come our way. And so, our story comes to a close, but the terror lingers. Remember, not every howl in the desert wind is from a coyote, and those glowing eyes in the darkness might not be from an animal at all. If you ever find yourself alone in the wilds, just be sure you're not being hunted by something far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. This is Mr. Scary Guy saying, good night, and sleep tight, if you dare. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe by clicking the icon above. We've also got a playlist full of scary stories on your left side, and a suggested video you'll love on the right. Choose one and keep the scares going.